All right. Well, good morning and welcome to Sunday School, Crossroads Bible Church. We do have kind of a small group this morning, but I'm glad you all made it. And I'm glad those of you that stayed home, stayed home. That didn't quite come out right. Well, you know what I mean. Sometimes better not to risk it. We are in Joshua chapter 7 this morning. My intention is to cover this chapter in two lessons. Chapters 7 and 8 actually go together. They're a unit, and they have to do with the conquest of Ai and also the sin of Achan. And I would kind of infer that this is an important section because the author takes up 2 chapters to cover it. So it's not just a minor blip on the screen, it's important. I'll address this in more detail when we get to the end of this section, not today, but later on. But something to keep in mind, if you can remember to do so as we go through here, there are some very interesting parallels and contrasts between this story of Achan and Ai and what we previously read about Rahab. Like I said, I'll come back to that in more detail later on, but they're almost mirror images of each other, and it's a fascinating set to compare. Just something to keep in the back of your mind as we move along. Chapter 7 of Joshua, and I'm intending here to get through the first 9 verses. Let me read verse 1 with you. Joshua 7 and verse 1. But the sons of Israel acted unfaithfully in regard to the things under the ban. For Achan, the son of Carmi, the son of Zabdi, the son of Zerah, from the tribe of Judah, took some of the things under the ban. And therefore the anger of the Lord burned against the sons of Israel. We have this verse given to us prior to, if you read ahead, the next verse, they start toward Ai. They start that process. So why does he give us this notification first? Why not just leave it until later on? And I think there's an important reason that he does that. It alerts us to the fact that somebody has violated the ban, and there's sin in the camp, if you will, and therefore we as the reader are not shocked when things go really badly at Ai. Okay? If we didn't have this notification, and we read through the next section on their defeated Ai, we'd be like, what's up? But this alerts us ahead of time, there's sin in the camp, this is not going to go well. Or at least we may not conclude that yet, but we know that that's a possibility. Now, of course, this information about Achan having stolen stuff is not known to the rest of the camp or to Joshua at the time that this is written, at the time these events are taking place. So we get a little sneak peek that gives us like some pre-information on what's going on here. Couple of fun illustrations here of Achan. This is not Achan, but the Greeks often decorated their cups and vessels and bowls and whatnot with pictures like this in the middle. It's called a tondo. And this tondo has Diomedes stealing a little statue called the Palladion. He took it out of a temple. In a sense, it comes from Greek mythology, and it's a common motif you see in Greek art. But what he's doing here is he's running away with a god that he has stolen. And I think it was a little bit reminiscent of what happens here with Achan. Achan, of course, that we know of, didn't actually steal an idol. At least it's not stated that way. But in another way, he did. He was stealing from God. This is another, a little later than our time, the time of Joshua, but a little Greco-Roman statue that shows a thief with a big smirk on his face that has a purse of money that he's stolen. And he's actually sitting on an altar, opening that up to take the money. And again, it kind of reminded me of what Achan did here. Thought he got away with something, thinks so still, and obviously has not. Okay, let's move on to verse 2. Verse 2 is a fun one. Now Joshua sent men from Jericho to Ai, which is near Beth-aven, east of Bethel, and said to them, "Go up and spy out the land." So the men went up and spied out Ai. How many place names are in this verse? Well, Ai gets repeated, but if you just count that as one, there's 4. That is a lot of geographical data in one verse, right? So we're starting off at Jericho. That's where their camp is. They have defeated and demolished the city of Jericho. They're probably actually encamped at Gilgal, and we don't know exactly where that's at, but somewhere on the plain east of Jordan. By the way, this aerial photo, the airplane is over the hills of Judea looking toward the east. So you can see Jericho down there. This is from the south, and Ai is to the west. You can see how the hills of Judea, Samaria come out there, and then just kind of drop off in a cliff face, and then you have the flat plain. So they're out on that plain, and they're headed up toward Ai. You should have a copy of this map, although maybe not in quite so good a color, on your handout. And I want to talk with you a little bit about the location of Ai, because it's been a real point of controversy around the reliability of the Bible. The consensus among just archaeologists and biblical historians at large has been Ai was not inhabited at the time of Joshua. I guess that's for those that actually concede that there was a historical Joshua. Many of them don't. Many of them deny that there ever was a conquest either. But the evidence at Ai is a key point, just like earlier we saw the evidence of Jericho was. There are 3 different places that have been suggested as the location of Ai, and they're on this map as little yellow dots. That's a bit small. Hopefully you can make that out. One of them is a site that's just known as Etel. That's the northernmost. I'm going to go ahead and... So we have Etel here, we have Makader over here, and we have Nissia down here. Etel was excavated back in the 60s? Yeah, 60s and 70s. I want to show you and read for you a quote from the guy that excavated there, and I think this will give you a flavor for where most of scholarship is today. Again, that's very broadly speaking, secular scholarship. He declared that archaeology has wiped out the historical credibility of the conquest of Ai, as reported in Joshua's time of Abraham, and then it was empty until the Iron Age, which is the time of the late judges, early kings. So that whole hundreds of years in between, there was no city there was no inhabitation at Etel. Well, then obviously the story of Ai is made up, right? Well, there's a pretty serious issue there if he has the right site. How does he know he's got the right site? Well, that's an interesting question. Let me show you just a couple of pictures of Etel. Here you can see it circled in the foreground. And the site that I'll try to convince you is actually Ai is Khirbet el Makader. I'll try to refer to that just as Makader as we go along, which is only a half mile away. Etel, it's an impressive site. Well, I don't know if you're going to think that, looking at that. There's a lot of remains there even today, and Callaway uncovered some really cool stuff, but he obviously did not uncover anything from what we're looking at. Well, let's see, is the late Bronze Age. A massive city wall. That's what that row of rocks is, the remains of a huge early bronze city wall. You've got this timeline on your handout as well, which you can see that Etel is uninhabited from the early Bronze Age until the Iron Age. There was an Iron Age city there. Khirbet Nisya, I'm not going to spend much time on that. There's one guy that suggested that that might be, because obviously Etel was not. He went and dug at Nisya. His name was David Livingston, just like the missionary to Africa. He found some pottery from the late Bronze Age, but no buildings at all. No buildings, no city wall, no structures at all, just a little scattering of late bronze pottery. And the third site there, Makader, which only begun to be excavated here in the last 1990s. They went through 2000, the early 2000s. Actually had a late bronze fortress there. Well, the city was a fortress. And all three of them were inhabited during the Iron Age. So let me show you. This is Makader in the foreground, and you can see Etel in the background. So it's kind of reverse of the earlier photo that we looked at. The site is very shallow. You can see bedrock exposed in that photo. And bedrock was exposed in a lot of areas before they even started digging. So that tells you that it's going to be difficult to find much of anything, and they found, I think, an amazing amount of stuff. I know this isn't a whole lot to look at, some stub walls, and you kind of have to draw it out as you excavate it, because it quickly gets overgrown with weeds and stuff crumbles, and it becomes almost unintelligible if you're not an archaeologist. And I realize this is a little awkward to look at, but I want to come back to a couple of pictures there. We had this notification. Oh, I didn't give you a whole lot there. So back to our map. We read in verse 2 here that Ai is near Beth Aven, and it's east of Bethel. So Bethel should be to its west, and Beth Aven is near, whatever that means. There has been much debate also about the location of Bethel. Bethel is mentioned many times in the Bible. We know approximately where it's at, but to pinpoint the location, because there are so many sites in this area, has proven a bit difficult. Probably the most common for those that accept Etel as the location of Ai would be to consider Beitin, the modern village of Beitin, to be to be Bethel. For those that would place, I've got just Beth Aven here. I've got another map coming up with the red dots. Forgive me. So Bethel, I think, is more likely located here at Elbira, which is pretty much straight west of Ai or Mercator, and Beth Aven probably up there. There's a number of tiny little sites that clearly were inhabited during this period, and yet this place is today is almost continuous buildings, villages that have expanded. It's almost a single big metropolis. And that makes it really difficult to do any excavation work up here. It's right on the ridge route. Even today there's modern highway going through there. I don't know if you can see the ridge route right here. And so it's a heavily inhabited place even today. Let's see. Here's my map with the little red dots on it, which are Bethel. So I think I give that to you. Yes, I do on your handout. I'm convinced the most likely locations are that Ai is located at Mercator, Bethel, straight west of that at Beitin. I'm sorry, at Elbira, or perhaps Ras Tahuna. Could be either one of those. And Beth Aven there at Beitin. So here's an aerial of that. This is looking from the west. Interestingly, well, you can see how that area now is just covered with buildings. The site of Gibeon is in the foreground of this photo, only a few miles away. Gibeon is going to come back to haunt the Israelites because it's men from Gibeah that come to them and pretend to be from a long, long way away, and the Israelites unwisely make a covenant with them. Gibeon is also, in the early days of Solomon, it's where the tabernacle was located. So an important site that's not too far away. Okay, so just another couple aerial shots. So you can tell that all of these sites are in pretty close proximity to each other. Let's see. This is a Google Earth view of kind of the same thing. And one of the things I like about this is that you can actually see Jericho in the background, and all of these sites. Let me put an arrow in there for you. So Jericho is visible clear up at the top of the photo. And then you can also see the route that the spies would have taken as they came up to spy this area out. It's almost 100% certain this is the route they would have taken, because any other route would have been tens, if not dozens of miles out of the way, and they would not have come up one of these steep canyons. There's a single road that that exists between Ai and Jericho, and that's it. Perhaps even in part like this, although this photo is from further south down in the Sinai. So they came back in verse 3. They returned to Joshua and said to him, "Don't let all the people go up. Only about 2,000 or 3,000 men need to go up to Ai. Don't make all the people toil up there, for they are few." That's an important notice. Ai is not a big city. Ai is they're few, whatever that means. And this is a scale drawing of the site of Mercator as it's been reconstructed by the archaeologists. And you can tell it's small. It amounts to about 2.5 acres, which is not very big for a city. It does have a gate. This view is looking south, so we're looking at the north side of the I'm tempted just to call it a fortress. Kind of like an old outpost out west with a few scattered buildings inside of it. And I thought it might be fun to do a comparison. You might remember this from when we looked at the size of Jericho as it relates to where we're at. You can see our church there in the middle, and our driveway, which is now all white, but you'll understand that. Oh, the same scale as the ark. Yeah, that's a good point, Bill. Uh-huh. Yeah, yeah. I hadn't thought about that, but that's good. And then here I've added in the city of Ai. Fits easily within the acreage of the house just to the east of us here. 114 yards across at the widest point. So you can understand why the spies would come back and say, it ain't worth sending the whole army up there. There's not many guys there. A few thousand of us can take it. Well, what happened? Oops. Verse 4. So about 3,000 men from the people went up there, but they fled from the men of Ai. And the men of Ai struck down about 36 of their men and pursued them from the gate as far as Shebarim, and struck them down on the descent. So the hearts of the people melted and became as water. So they sent up 3,000. Once again, it's hard to tell if this is literally the number 3,000 or if it's 3 military units of a smaller size. I think it could legitimately be taken either way, and I'm not sure exactly what to do with it here. But just by way of comparison, you might recall earlier when the Israelites crossed over that the military men of Manasseh, Gad, and Reuben, who had decided to live on the other side of the Jordan, the military men came over with them, and just from those 3 tribes was 40,000. Now again, perhaps it was 40 military units as opposed to 40,000. It's hard to tell in my opinion, but you can see the ratio quite easily. 40 come over just from those 3 tribes. That's not to mention the other 9 tribes, and only 3 go up to Ai. This is a very small number. And the text tells us they fled. No reason is given. Now, we have an idea because of the notice given to us in verse 1. There was sin in the camp. But they don't know that. And there's no reason given. It's not like, oh, they had chariots. Or, oh, they were so strong. They had the latest military equipment. They rallied in troops from all over the region. There's no excuse like that given. It's just a small number of guys came out against them, and the Israelites just melted away. Not good. That statement that their hearts melted and became like water sounds a little bit like what Rahab said in Joshua chapter 2. A number of times she made references to the Canaanites. Their hearts melted. They were in absolute fear of the Israelites. And so the tables have turned. Now it's the Israelites that are petrified and running from their enemies, even when you would expect that they would prevail. They chased them from the gate. The excavators who uncovered Mercator found a late bronze gate there. This is a photo of what you would see today, going and looking at what they uncovered. And this is a drawing, a plan of that. I don't know if you can see any correlation between those at all. Do you see the U-shaped stones there? That's the base of one of the compartments of this gate. Now you might ask, how do they know it was a gate, Kris? Legitimate question. They also found, which I think is amazing, they found 5 pivot stones that are gate-sized. Here are 2 of them with some of the guys that work there pointing at them. They're not a little pivot stone like you would put in a house. These are giant blocks. You understand the pivot of the wooden gate would set down in that socket and pivot on it. And they found 5 of these. That's maybe a little bit easier to see the section of that gate compartment there than the previous one I showed you. And interestingly enough, it's on the northern side of the site, which is exactly where the text will describe it as being. But they chased him from the gate, and it says to Shebarim. As far as Shebarim, there's not, that we know of, any city, town, or village between Makkedah and Jericho. It really gets dry as you begin that descent from the ridge, and there simply are no towns there. And it's quite possible that word Shebarim is not intended to refer to a town or village either, but that it's a geographical feature. It can mean something that's shattered or broken, and as you descend down that direction, there is a lot of, the modern road kind of follows along where the ancient road did. You can see just a lot of shattered stone. In fact, they used some of this as a quarry in antiquity as well. So that's kind of a best guess as to what Shebarim refers to. Not a town, but a geographical feature. Of course, we do understand what it means, the descent, because from Ai to Jericho is all descent. In fact, you descend over 3,000 feet from Ai to Jericho in that 12 and a half miles. It's a long way down, and so they were hoofing it downhill and being chased. Verse 6. Then Joshua tore his clothes and fell to the earth on his face before the ark of the Lord until evening, both he and the elders of Israel, and they put dust on their heads. A few years ago, I never would have believed that we could actually illustrate something like that, but this is an Egyptian illustration of mourners who are throwing dust on their heads as an act of mourning. And you can see they've drawn the little dots coming down to illustrate the dust. About 1400 BC, so not too far from the time of Joshua here. Of course, tearing a garment was also a sign of mourning. For us, clothes are kind of disposable. For them, they were much more expensive because they were much more difficult to make. Everything was made and woven and sewn by hand. So to tear your garments, you were tearing something that was expensive, and it was a sign of mourning. And of course, bowing down on his face to God also expressed that. So he's pretty much doing everything you could think of to demonstrate how upset he is, and I'm kind of taking that from the text that follows here. Verse 7, Joshua 7, verse 7, Joshua said, "Alas, O Lord God, why did you ever bring this people over the Jordan, only to deliver us into the hand of the Amorites and to destroy us? If only we'd been willing to dwell in the land beyond the Jordan." Ooh. Is that what you were expecting? I wish we'd stayed home. Well, of course, he has no idea why this has come to pass. God will tell him next week. But he's heartbroken. You know, we came off of Jericho, and now we were going to go take this little tiny town, and they have just whooped us. I can't help but wonder. This is from an armchair perspective, looking back thousands of years. So I'll try to cut him a little slack. But it's kind of like, Joshua, what are you thinking? Have you forgotten the God that split the Jordan River and took all you guys over? Who took down Jericho for you without you shooting an arrow or doing anything? Just he flattened the walls and let you walk straight in, gave you the whole thing. Have you forgotten this stuff? I mean, not to mention, and his words here kind of sound like the Israelites when they had just come out of Egypt. God opened up the Dead Sea for them and they crossed, and then they ran short on food. Oh man, I remember the food we used to have back. Why did we have to leave that place? Right? It's like, you guys, really? It's not the response I would have expected out of Joshua. This is the promised land. If only we'd been willing to dwell beyond the Jordan. Dude, the whole point before their enemies. For the Canaanites and all the inhabitants of the land will hear of it, and they will surround us and cut off our name from the earth. And what will you do for your great name? So he mentions two things that he's afraid of there. One is, we're going to get wiped out. Our reputation as this mighty people just went down the toilet. This is going to embolden all of our enemies. They're going to surround us and wipe us out. And the second thing he mentions is, what's this going to do to your reputation, God? That's also reminiscent of something, I think at least, of Moses. When God says, Moses, stand aside and I'm going to wipe out this people. And Moses says, God, what's this going to do to your reputation? The Egyptians are going to make fun. They're going to say, oh, he brought them out into the wilderness just to kill them. And this sounds a little bit like that. God, your reputation is on the line here too. If your people are wiped out by the Canaanites. A few things to think about here. Just like with Jericho, the conquest of any part of the Promised Land was directly tied to obedience to God. This whole giving of the land conquest thing was God's project, not Israel's project, right? I mean, they did have to actually put boots on the ground, but it wasn't up to them to get the best military equipment, to have the most people, to have the best strategy. God was granting them this land and fighting on their behalf. We will see that again and again in the book of Joshua, where God miraculously gives them the victory. That's another reason I think Joshua should have sat back a moment and paused to wonder, what's going on here? Because this is God's battle, and he clearly did not fight in our behalf. Why not? What gives? He'll find out shortly, but second point here, sin inhibits our ability to do what's right. And if unchecked, it's disastrous, which clearly it was here. Achan has not been found out yet. He and his family have not been destroyed yet. They will be. But already his sin has been disastrous for other people. An important principle, I think, to keep in mind. The sins that we commit are usually not restricted only to ourselves. They do affect other people, and sometimes when it goes far enough, it is disastrous, not only for ourselves but for others. And we see the beginning of that here. 36 Israelites died. People that had not committed the sin that Achan committed, but they paid a price for what he had done. That's sobering. Achan's sin directly affected many others besides himself or even his family. Again, those 36 who gave their lives because of what he had done. And finally, Joshua's misdirected longing for an easier time and place is probably too common. I think we sometimes are guilty of that same thing. Not every day, but on occasion I think, God, why did I have to go through this? Where are you at? Why is it so tough? I wish I could go back to whatever. And I mean, you hear Joshua saying that. Why weren't we content to stay on the other side of the Jordan? Well, that wasn't God's plan this whole time. I think sometimes we do the same thing. I'd just like to end with Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 1. The author says, "Let us lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us." Sin has a way of entangling us and messing up all kinds of things. And Paul, or whoever wrote the book of Hebrews, says, get rid of that and stop looking back. Clean out the sin and move forward. And that is a pattern we'll see here with Joshua once God tells him, hey, you got sin in the camp, buddy. You need to clean that up. He will do what the author of Hebrews here calls for. Any questions or comments? We'll look a little more at I. Probably not next week, because next week is Achan, but the week after when they go back up again, because the geography of this place, Mercator, fits the story to a T. I didn't want to cover that today because of the connection with the ambush, but if you look at your map, you might even be able to figure out what that is. But Pam? Yeah. Yeah, Jericho was so easy. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah, there does seem to be some overconfidence here. And, I didn't mention this, maybe you thought of it yourself, they never inquired of God, or at least not that's recorded. God, what's our next step? All we hear is Joshua said, send some guys up to Ai. And the guys come back and, we just need a few guys. And nobody consults God, which should have been the first thing they did, right? God's pretty responsive. Oh my goodness. When they made a treaty with the Gibeonites, yeah, that one hounded them for centuries. Yeah, good. Okay. Next week, Lord willing, we'll look at Achan and his family and their fate. And then that'll bring us into chapter 8, where we get the actual conquest of the city of Ai. Let me close in a word of prayer. Lord, thank you for your word, and for the way that you teach us through it. Help us to consider these events. I pray that we would look inward and give some thought to the way that we think and the way that we behave. Help us to grow in our faith. Help us to be critical of ourselves in the sense of looking for sin in our own lives and then dealing with it quickly. We know that you are full of grace and compassion, and you forgive quickly and easily if we ask. And so help us to be quick to confess our sin and to come to you for that. And we're so grateful for your love for us, and just ask that you would strengthen us in our faith and strengthen us to be obedient to you. In your name I pray. Amen.